What if I told you that the existence of modern-day Israel was foretold in the Bible thousands of years ago? While the world often sees Israel in terms of political struggles, borders, and conflict, few realize the profound spiritual significance of this nation. What makes Israel unique is not just its ancient history, but the fact that its very survival and rebirth are considered by many to be part of God's prophetic plan. But here's the part that might surprise you. God's promise to Abraham, the foundation of Israel, was not initially exclusive to one group of people. It was a promise of blessing to all nations, yet it narrowed down through Abraham's descendants, particularly through Isaac. So why did the covenantal promise go to Isaac and not Ishmael, both of whom were Abraham's sons, and who exactly inherited the promised land God gave to Abraham? By the end of this journey, you'll have a clear understanding of how the Bible prophesied Israel's future, why certain people were chosen over others, and how Israel's story is still unfolding today in ways that impact prophecy and the end times. The story of Israel doesn't begin with Abraham. It begins much earlier with Noah. After the great flood, Noah's 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, became the ancestors of all nations. Israel's roots specifically come through Shem, and it is from this lineage that we get the term Semitic peoples. In Genesis 10, the Table of Nations outlines Noah's descendants and shows the lineage of Shem, leading eventually to Eber, who became the ancestor of the Hebrews. This genealogy is essential because it ties Israel to the beginning of post-flood humanity, linking them directly to Noah's blessing for his son Shem. Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem. May Canaan be the servant of Shem. Genesis 9:26. From Shem came Eber, and from Eber eventually came Terah, the father of Abram, later known as Abraham. This lineage is significant because it marks the people of Israel as coming from a line that was blessed to be the bearers of God's covenant. It is from this line of Shem that Abraham emerges, and through him, God would lay out his plan for a nation that would not only inherit a land, but also serve as a blessing to all nations. But how did this blessing narrow down to a specific lineage? That's where the Abrahamic covenant comes into play. The turning point in the story of Israel comes with God's covenant with Abraham. In Genesis 12, God called Abram to leave his home and promised to make him the father of a great nation. The Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." Genesis 12:1-3. This Abrahamic covenant was initially inclusive, a promise of blessing to all nations through Abraham's descendants. God's intention was that Abraham's seed would bring forth the nation of Israel, which would not only inherit a physical land but also serve as a spiritual beacon for the entire world. However, the covenant narrowed its focus through Abraham's son Isaac rather than his firstborn son Ishmael. This raises a question: why Isaac and not Ishmael? After all, both were sons of Abraham, but they had very different roles in God's plan. Ishmael, the son of Abraham by Hagar, Sarah's Egyptian servant, was the firstborn son. According to the customs of the time, Ishmael would have been the natural heir, but God had a different plan. Although Ishmael did not inherit the covenantal promise, God did not abandon him. In Genesis 17, God reassures Abraham that Ishmael too would be blessed. "As for Ishmael, I have heard you. I will surely bless him. I will make him fruitful, and will greatly increase his numbers. He will be the father of 12 rulers, and I will make him into a great nation." Genesis 17:20. Ishmael was indeed blessed to become the father of a great nation. The Arab peoples trace their lineage back to Ishmael. God honored Abraham's love for Ishmael by ensuring that he too would multiply and prosper. However, the spiritual covenant, the promised land, and the blessing of Israel would go through Isaac, the son of promise. Isaac, the son born to Abraham and Sarah in their old age, was the child through whom the covenant promises would be fulfilled. This wasn't about favoritism, it was about God's sovereign choice. Isaac's birth was miraculous, a fulfillment of God's promise when all natural hope seemed lost due to Sarah's barrenness. God confirmed to Abraham that the everlasting covenant would go through Isaac, not Ishmael. But my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah will bear to you by this time next year. Genesis 17:21. Isaac's role as the child of promise is critical to understanding Israel's inheritance of the promised land. While Ishmael was also blessed, the land and the spiritual destiny of being a chosen people were passed to Isaac. The focus shifted from Abraham's physical descendants to his covenantal descendants, those who would carry forward the promises tied to Israel as God's chosen people. But how long did it take for Abraham's descendants to actually inherit the promised land? The story of Israel's inheritance is one of faith, struggle, and divine timing. Though God promised Abraham the land of Canaan, it was several generations before his descendants fully inherited the land. Abraham never saw the complete fulfillment of this promise during his lifetime, but he lived in Canaan as a sojourner, trusting that God's promise would one day come to pass. God reaffirmed the covenant promise to both Isaac and his son Jacob, later renamed Israel, ensuring that Abraham's descendants would one day inherit the land. In Genesis 26, God said to Isaac, "Stay in this land for a while, and I will be with you and will bless you. For to you and your descendants I will give all these lands, and will confirm the oath I swore to your father, Abraham." Genesis 26:3. Similarly, in Genesis 28, God spoke to Jacob, reaffirming the promise of land and descendants. "Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring." Genesis 28:14. However, it wasn't until several centuries later, during the time of Moses and Joshua, that the Israelites finally took full possession of the Promised Land. After spending 400 years in Egyptian slavery and wandering in the wilderness for 40 years, the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were led by Joshua to conquer Canaan. The fulfillment of the land promise came around 500 years after God first made his covenant with Abraham. The story of Israel's inheritance of the Promised Land is most famously marked by the event of the Exodus. After centuries of slavery in Egypt, the Israelites were delivered by Moses, who led them out of Egypt and into the wilderness, where they received the law of God on Mount Sinai. This period in the wilderness was not only about physical liberation, but about transforming the descendants of Abraham into a theocratic nation under God's direct rule. The Sinai covenant established the 10 Commandments and other laws which would govern Israel's relationship with God and one another. God's promise of land was again repeated, but with a caveat: obedience. The inheritance of the land was directly tied to the faithfulness of the Israelites to God's laws. They were called to be holy, a kingdom of priests, and a light to the nations. "Now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." Exodus 19:5-6. After 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, Joshua led the Israelites into Canaan, beginning the conquest of the Promised Land. The land was divided among the 12 tribes of Israel, marking the first time that the descendants of Abraham physically inherited the land God had promised them. But the Mosaic covenant also contained a warning. If Israel turned away from God, they would be exiled from the land. This would become a tragic reality later in Israel's history, leading to their Babylonian exile and eventual return, yet another fulfillment of prophecy. Despite inheriting the Promised Land, the history of Israel is marked by periods of faithfulness and rebellion. Over time, Israel's idolatry and disobedience led to their downfall. In 586 BC, God allowed the Babylonian Empire under Nebuchadnezzar to conquer Jerusalem, destroy the first temple, and carry the people into exile. This event was foretold by the prophets, particularly Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. The exile was not just a punishment, but also a period of refinement for Israel, with the promise that God would restore his people once they repented. One of the most profound prophecies of restoration came from Jeremiah. This is what the Lord says: "When 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will come to you and fulfill my good promise to bring you back to this place. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." Jeremiah 29:10-11. After 70 years of Babylonian captivity, the Persian king Cyrus issued a decree allowing the Jews to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple, fulfilling Jeremiah's prophecy. However, this was only a partial fulfillment. The prophet spoke of a greater restoration that would come in the end times, when Israel would experience both physical and spiritual redemption. The story of Israel takes an extraordinary turn in the 20th century. After nearly 2,000 years of dispersion following the destruction of the Second Temple in AD 70, the Jewish people returned to their ancestral homeland in 1948 to re-establish the nation of Israel, a moment that many believe fulfilled centuries-old prophecies. In Isaiah 66:8, the prophet foretells the miraculous rebirth of Israel. Who has ever heard of such things? Who has ever seen things like this? Can a country be born in a day, or a nation be brought forth in a moment? Yet no sooner is Zion in labor than she gives birth to her children. Isaiah 66:8. On May 14th, 1948, this prophecy was fulfilled when the State of Israel was officially declared. This event wasn't just a political miracle, but a supernatural fulfillment of God's promise to bring his people back to their land. The rebirth of Israel marked the beginning of the end-time clock, with many believing it signals the approach of the Messianic era. However, the Bible tells us that Israel's spiritual restoration is still yet to come. While the nation has been physically restored, many prophecies, particularly in the New Testament, point to a future time when Israel will recognize their Messiah, bringing the final chapters of God's plan to fruition. The Bible makes it clear that Israel will play a central role in the end times, leading up to the return of the Messiah. In Zechariah 12:10, we read about a future event where Israel will finally recognize their Messiah. "They will look on me, the one they have pierced, and they will mourn for him as one mourns for an only child, and grieve bitterly for him as one grieves for a firstborn son." Zechariah 12:10. This prophecy indicates that in the end times, the people of Israel will acknowledge Jesus Christ as the Messiah they have long awaited. The Apostle Paul echoes this idea in Romans 11, where he describes a future time when all Israel will be saved. Israel has experienced a hardening in part until the full number of the Gentiles has come in, and in this way all Israel will be saved. Romans 11:25-26. According to biblical prophecy, Israel's spiritual restoration will coincide with the return of Christ and the establishment of the Messianic kingdom. The Bible describes a time when the Messiah will rule the nations from Jerusalem, bringing peace and justice to the world. Israel, once again, will be at the heart of God's plan for the nations. Israel's journey from its origins in Noah's descendants through the Abrahamic covenant, the Exodus, the Babylonian exile, and finally its rebirth in 1948 is not just a story of history, but one of divine prophecy. Israel is not merely a political entity, it is the centerpiece of God's redemptive plan for the world. As we move closer to the end times, Israel's role in biblical prophecy becomes even more critical. The physical restoration of Israel is a testament to God's faithfulness, but the spiritual restoration is still to come. As the Bible makes clear, the most significant chapters in Israel's story are still unfolding, with the Messiah set to return and establish his kingdom in Jerusalem. In the end, the story of Israel is a story of faith, promise, and prophecy, a story that began in Genesis and will conclude with the return of Christ.